They trusted the Kammhuber Line's radars along the Elbe on the night of 24 July 1943. Tinfoil cut into narrow strips poured from a bomber stream, and within 15 minutes, the scopes were unusable. Subscribe for new, deeply researched World War II investigations every day. Elbe Bend, south of Hamburg, night of Saturday, 24th July, 1943, just after 23:30. A warm, high-pressure air mass kept the lower atmosphere stable. Ground haze sat over the marsh edges near Finkenwerder, while inland the city's sodium lamps bled upward. In Würzburg D sites from Scharnhorst to Stede, and in Freya stations arrayed behind them, operators settled to the routine of night defense. Detect at long range on VHF, hand off to precision tracking on UHF, feed bearing and height to Himmelbett, and tracking on UH controllers who would vector night fighters by voice. The rule was dependable. A single moving blip became a track. A track became an interception vector. A vector, if the crew were competent, became a firing pass. The geometry worked because the sky offered few returns. At 23:40, the geometry failed. The first packets of metallized paper, aluminum foil cut to a tuned half-wavelength, fell from Royal Air Force heavy bombers at altitudes around 18 to 20,000 feet west of the Elbe. Each packet dispersed into a small cloud that tumbled and reflected, then multiplied across the Kammhuber boxes as fresh packets followed at measured intervals. Across the Kammhuber box on Würzburg, scopes that normally showed a clean dot for a single target, the phosphor filled with drifting, pulsing snow. Freya long-range sets, accustomed to thin traffic lines, thickened into curtains. What had been sparse returns became a meadow of false echoes. A chain of witness objects fixes the moment. The first is a sector radar plot from YAG Division headquarters near Dielen. The plotter's grease pencil, usually tracing a handful of inbound lanes, broadened into shaded swaths covering 3 adjacent boxes by shortly before midnight, a visual that persisted for over 1 hour, or midnight. The second is a decoded signal summary from the British Y service compiled at Chicksands the following afternoon, noting a spike in short control transmissions from German ground-controlled interception posts without corresponding claims, an anomaly that typically meant controllers were speaking into uncertainty. The third is an after-action report page from Number 5 Group, filed at Grantham on the morning of 25th July, recording a pre-briefed drill. Each aircraft to release small bundles of window at fixed seconds after waypoint crossings, replenished every few minutes until the target run. Point crossings. The fourth is a maintenance card from a Würzburg R site outside Harburg, where the technician logged no fault found on the set despite the crew's complaint of a filled screen, an entry dated the same night. The human lever for the release of this deception had been moved weeks earlier and far from the river. In early July, after years of withholding the countermeasure for fear of reciprocity, an Air Staff order authorized operational use. The minute sheet carried the initials of the Chief of the Air Staff and referenced trials at the Telecommunications Research Establishment that had married wavelength to strip length and validated fall rates from service altitudes. The authorization did not select a token sortie, service altitudes. It specified scale. Every main force heavy to carry a calculated mass of bundles to be dispensed at a rate tied to ground speed and waypoint spacing. So the bomber stream extruded a continuous corridor of confusion. Over the Elbe that night, the corridor did exactly that. Add Himmelbett control cabins, the plotting tables that normally carried neat wooden blocks, one for the hostile, one for the friendly night fighter, became lifeless when no solid track could be sustained beyond a few miles. Controllers issued vectors that sent fighters to empty coordinates. The voice circuits grew clipped, then sparse, as fuel clocks ticked. Voice circuits grew clipped. At the same time, the bomber stream exploited a different old rule that the Kammhuber system had made predictable. Attacks used to be staggered in small packets, which allowed defenders to mass fighters in succession. Bomber Command's new doctrine, refined through spring and early summer, drove a dense stream through a single window in time and space, compressing the burden on plotting teams even before the foil descended. The immediate tactical metrics appeared by dawn in the logs. Claims versus contacts diverged. Controller notebooks tallied dozens of plots lost, while confirmed shootdowns fell well below the mean for a raid of this scale and distance. In the 5th Group AAR page, already cited, a margin note recorded a detail that would recur in subsequent analyses. Predicted searchlight cones failed to lock in synchrony with radar cues, and gun laying by Würzburg-controlled batteries was erratic at and gun ranges where their range tables otherwise performed. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken later would show the operational consequence on the ground in Hamburg. Act 2 will track that. But the night of evidence shows something more granular. A system designed on the assumption of sparse, well-behaved returns was overwhelmed by a cheap, physics-honest trick that multiplied clutter until the meaningful signal could not be distinguished. Multiplied clutter, and not every station went blind at once. Some Würzburg crews reported moments when a target shimmered through the clutter long enough to push a fighter toward a merge. Those episodes, however, depended on happenstance gaps in the falling foil, and on crew intuition more than on doctrine. A Freya post near Cuxhaven noted that raising the minimum range gate helped briefly. Another crew tried manual offset tracking, only to lose the echo as fresh bundles drifted into the lobe. The maintenance card from Harburg already mentioned underscores the point. The hardware had not failed. The environment had been engineered to make success unlikely. On the British side, the decision path that led to this night tried to anticipate the moral hazard. If the Luftwaffe copied the idea, British cities would be at risk. The Air Staff Minute reconciled that by noting relative radar dependence and by betting on speed. Bomber Command would gain a decisive interval of advantage before the reciprocal appeared. The production tally attached to the order shows how seriously that bet was placed. In the fortnight before the Hamburg operation, factories cut and packaged aluminium strips by the tens of millions, bundled by crew position to simplify dispensing under blackout conditions. Bundled by crew position. Loading sheets from Lincolnshire stations list extra sacks added to Lancaster and Halifax bomb bays beside markers and flares. Weight increments small relative to the bomb load, but large in effect. By the small hours, the Cam Hooper boxes along the bomber lane looked nothing like the classroom diagrams. The rule, radar sees, controller vectors, fighter kills, had been erased by material that cost pennies. Yet, the contradiction at the edge of the map pinched the certainty. South of the primary lane, a handful of night fighters, steered by ground observers and aided by chance, still found targets and made isolated kills. The effect along the Elbe was undeniable. The hint that the shock would not remain unique lay in the paperwork leaving both headquarters by morning. Not remain unique. The order that unlocked the foil did not travel as a flourish. It moved as a paper trail with times, initials, and annexes. In early July, Air Staff minute sheets authorized operational use of the long-shelved countermeasure under the deliberate name that masked its simplicity. Attached were 2 witness objects that set the tone for rollout. A production tally from the Telecommunications Research Establishment showing trial bundles dropped from service altitudes with measured fall rates and persistence times, and a plain language note that linked strip length to enemy wavelengths. One set cut to frustrate long-range search sets, and another tailored to gun-laying precision radars. In search sets, the decision fused physics to logistics. Within a fortnight, packing lists from Midlands contractors recorded sacks of aluminium strips delivered by rail to Lincolnshire bomber stations, each sack labeled by crew position so that dispensing never paused when the navigator's hands were busy. Over a chart, the system that this paper trail set out to break had grown in careful layers. German early warning relied on long wavelength sets that gave bearing and rough range, handing off to shorter wavelength precision sets that could feed a controller's plotting table inside a Himmelbett cabin. There, an accepted sequence governed the night. A single clean return became a track. The controller moved 2 colored blocks on a lit grid, one for the hostile and one for a friendly night fighter. The fighter's airborne radar took over in the last miles. The countermeasure worked because those returns were vulnerable to a simple truth. A metal strip cut to roughly half the radar's wavelength behaves, briefly but convincingly, like an aircraft. Released in a timed stream from altitude. These strips tumbled and fell at a rate engineers could estimate, creating a field of false echoes that drifted, merged, and renewed faster than human hands could revise a plot. The first case study sits on the night already opened in Act 1, the opening blow of the Hamburg series. Units involved on the attacking side included Pathfinder Force to frame the aim point and heavy groups that followed the stream doctrine. On the defending side, the Kammhuber boxes along the Elbe and Night Fighter Gruppen staged within reach. Witness objects capture measurable effects. A decoded signal summary compiled by the British Y service the next day listed a burst of short controller transmissions that ended with abrupt silence, a pattern consistent with plots lost under clutter. Silence. A separate page in an RAF Group After Action report compared expected versus achieved night fighter interceptions for a target at that distance. The line for that night ran well below the mean for a route that long. A flak regiment's range table, recovered after the war and annotated during the raid, showed firing data centered on predicted heights but with corrections crossed out repeatedly, an implicit record of aim that never stabilized. The corridor of confusion did not make the bombers invisible. It made the defender's system inconsistent at the very moment concentration mattered. A second case study moved away from the Elbe's flatlands to a coastal bottleneck and a different kind of geometry. The Peenemünde strike in mid-August. The approach to the Baltic proving ground threaded between belts of early warning sets and gun-laying sites around the Pomeranian coast. The RAF plan layered deception and physics. A diversionary force drew fighters toward a capital to the southwest, while the mainstream advanced under a continuous fall of foil that thickened over the coastal radars, whose sighting exploited open water for clean returns. Rail manifests from bomber stations show the extra sacks issued to units tasked with the long over-water leg. Station loading sheets recorded dispensing rates calibrated to ground speed across waypoints over the sea, where drift could open gaps. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken at first light captured the immediate outcome. Clear strike signatures on workshops and housing blocks integral to the program's labor force. On workshops on the defensive side, German logs from a control room inland noted that coastal sets repeatedly acquired vast returns that dispersed rather than sharpened, forcing controllers to fall back on ground observers and sound locators that could not reach over the water. The bottleneck, normally a defender's advantage, became a wide door when the water's clean radar horizon filled with manufactured snow. A third case study belongs to the defender and shows doctrine trying to pivot out of the trap. Within weeks of the Hamburg shock, a fighter leader in the defense proposed and fielded a method that did not depend on ground radar vectors. Day fighters would climb into the night over cities lit by their own fires, free hunting by silhouette and exhaust glow. The method, later known by a feral name, spread quickly through designated Gruppen. Controller logs from several nights in late summer recorded fewer vector calls and more general authorizations to enter the zone over burning streets. The measurable effect is double-edged in the witness record. Claims rose on some nights in weather that favored visibility, seen in fragmentary tallies on JAG Division situation sheets, but accident reports and loss summaries show a cost in collisions, weather disorientation, and fuel exhaustion, especially when the city's fires died or cloud returned. The pivot could bite, but it could not replace the lost certainty of radar-to-radar handoff across an entire frontier. Explaining why the countermeasure worked at scale means taking it out of romance and placing it in procedure. Dispensing rates were planned in minutes and seconds per waypoint, so that the chaff field refreshed faster than a plotting team could clear it. Crews practiced one simple action: toss a bundle at a count, then repeat without pausing even under evasive turns. The reliability of the effect depended on two constraints the engineers had measured: how long a strip cloud stayed in the radar beam before falling below minimum range, and how long a human controller needed to decide that a given echo was worth a voice vector. On both counts, the calculations favored the attacker. Add the bomber stream doctrine: heavy aircraft spaced by seconds along a narrow route, and the rate at which new foil entered each Himmelbett box exceeded the rate at which plots could be maintained. In plain language, the human part of the system saturated. The German side did not stand still. The system saturated. Technical memoranda proposed filter circuits to ignore slowly drifting echoes. Radar crews experimented with raising minimum range gates or shifting frequency in small steps. Some of these measures showed promise in individual logs. A Würzburg site near a North Sea estuary noted that a higher range gate let one echo persist long enough to vector a fighter, a result written in a maintenance notebook with a tentative underline. A Freya station further inland tried a small frequency change that did not align with the foil's cut. The relief lasted minutes until fresh strips filled that band as well. Production files from later in the year show German engineers cutting and deploying their own foil, confirming that both sides understood the phenomenon. Their own foil. But the asymmetry persisted. The offense chose when and where to thicken the air with reflectors. The defense had to be right in every box all at once. Mid-act, a contradiction intrudes that forced refinement on the attacking side. The same reflective clouds that blinded enemy sets could also confuse friendly aids. Pathfinders reported moments when their own radar mapping returns were degraded near the densest corridors. In one station's navigation log, an oboe trial noted extra caution when transiting a segment seeded with heavy dispensing, a margined comment that became a line in later briefings. Do not saturate the approach to the aiming point so heavily that marking suffers. Saturate the approach to a maintenance card from a night fighter squadron on the British side recorded an airborne interception set that showed spurious flashes when a friendly stream ran ahead, tossing foil, an effect mitigated by tactics that offset the support patrols. The tool was not free. It required choreography. By early autumn, the paper trail that had begun with a cautious authorization had thickened into routine. Factory work orders show a rising curve of monthly strip output. An Air Ministry distribution note lists sacks consigned not only to Bomber Command, but also to maritime patrol units and to tactical air forces preparing to cross coastal belts in support of ground operations. The countermeasure had moved from special permission to standing item on a station's loading sheet. On the other side of the lines, defensive doctrine split into two branches, visible in orders and logs. Attempts to salvage radar control with refined gating and plotted patience, and the growing reliance on free hunting over illuminated targets when weather allowed. Neither branch erased the damage done on the night the rule broke. Across the three case studies, an opening blow over the Elbe, a coastal bottleneck on the Baltic, and a doctrinal pivot over burning cities, the measurable effect repeats in the documents. Burning cities. Interceptions fell below expected lines when foil corridors were maintained. Coastal radar belts lost their normal advantage, and the defenders' improvisation won some nights while taxing crews and aircraft at a rate that could not be sustained. The system had been unmasked not as fragile hardware, but as a human machine chain tuned to a sparse sky. The foil did not destroy it. It made it misread its own inputs long enough for an attacker to pass through. The morning after the first Hamburg raid, 25 July 1943, the operational outcomes were stark in the logbooks and photographs. Bomber Command's reconnaissance flights, run at first light, recorded extensive fires in the western and central quarters of Hamburg, a signature of accuracy not normally associated with night bombing. In contrast, Luftwaffe defensive claims were markedly thin. Situation sheets from Jag Division headquarters showed fewer than a dozen confirmed victories over a force numbering in the hundreds. Flak Regiment reports filed that morning admitted expenditure of ammunition at levels consistent with major raids, but gun-laying batteries could not demonstrate proportional hits. On the British side, group after-action reports confirmed bomber losses well below the mean for a long-distance raid to northern Germany. The foil had not eliminated risk. More than a score of aircraft failed to return. Yet against expected loss rates, the margin was significant enough that the air staff minutes signed before the raid were vindicated in their bet on advantage. By the end of July, as subsequent nights of Operation Gomorrah followed, the measure's sustained effect became impossible to ignore. Weather reports from the period confirm alternating clear and hazy nights. Raid results varied with conditions, but the one constant was the defenders' disorientation. Controller logs show sectors that failed to establish solid plots even when weather favored radar propagation. Conversely, civil defense records from Hamburg cataloged tens of thousands of casualties and large-scale destruction over the week, a grim testimony to the improved penetration of bombing streams. Here, the operational ripple is visible. German civil defense was overwhelmed not just by blast and fire, but by the failure of early warning to give predictable intervals for sheltering. In tactical terms, the breach in the Kammhuber line reduced the Luftwaffe night fighter arm's ability to inflict decisive attrition on the heavy bomber force. The doctrine that had carried Bomber Command to this point evolved rapidly. Station loading sheets from August onward show foil bundles listed beside standard bomb loads as integral as markers and flares. Training circulars issued to groups in September instructed crews in disciplined dispensing to maintain corridors without waste. A separate distribution list extended the countermeasure to Coastal Command, whose Liberators and Sunderlands faced radar-guided flak when hunting U-boats near the Bay of Biscay. A maintenance card from a Coastal Command squadron at Pembroke Dock noted trial use against a German Würzburg site near Brest, with navigators reporting clutter on the scopes consistent with bomber experiences inland. The doctrine's spread across commands signaled that the countermeasure had shifted from exceptional to routine. On the German side, the adaptation effort accelerated, but could not close the gap quickly. Technical files from late 1943 describe experimental filter circuits designed to suppress slowly drifting echoes. Filter circuits. A December memorandum from a radar school near Königsberg referenced field trials where raising the minimum range gate restored limited utility. At the same time, production records confirmed that German factories began cutting their own foil, called Duppel, by the autumn. Luftwaffe units did deploy it, especially to cover bomber sorties against Britain, yet the asymmetry held. The British had already integrated chaff into a doctrine that concentrated heavy bombers in dense streams, maximizing the advantage. German raids on Britain by late 1943 were too infrequent and small in scale to inflict comparable disruption. The very fear that had delayed the countermeasure's introduction proved justified, but the timing skewed its impact decisively. The outcomes shaped operations well beyond Hamburg. In November 1943, Bomber Command directed its first sustained campaigns against Berlin. After-action reports from that winter again show losses that, while heavy, did not climb to the prohibitive levels predicted by pre-window models. German air defense still exacted a toll. Weather, mechanical failure, and fighter attacks combined. But the corridor tactic remained viable. In the Mediterranean, foil found use covering strikes on Italian ports, with station manifests from North Africa listing bundles loaded onto Wellingtons and B-24s for sorties over coastal batteries. And in the Pacific, American forces adopted the practice by 1944, seeding Japanese radar nets before carrier strikes. The ripple effect had become global. The long-tail legacy extended into the post-war era in both doctrine and technology. Training manuals from the late 1940s list chaff deployment as a standard measure of electronic warfare. No longer a secret, but a baseline. Research at British and American laboratories turned to countermeasures, developing radar modes to filter clutter and algorithms to discriminate based on Doppler shifts. Wartime witness objects became teaching tools. A wartime RAF signal summary preserved at Bletchley shows as an example of system overload. A German flak regiment's annotated range table sits in Bundesarchiv as a caution against dependence on a range table sits a single sensing mode. The lesson seeded the next rule. No radar, however precise, should be trusted without redundancy against deception. The material legacy lay scattered in quieter places too. Maintenance cards with no fault found entries, echoes of crews confronted by filled screens, remained in site files until the war's end. Aerial reconnaissance photographs annotated with foil drift corridors survive as black and white frames marked with grease pencil. These objects testify that the countermeasure's impact was not merely operational but archival, leaving behind a record of a doctrine broken almost overnight. By 1945, as cities fell and radars were dismantled, the landscapes where the rule had first collapsed returned to stillness. The Elbe's bends flowed as they had before, marsh haze settling again in summer heat. But the precedent endured. In war, the air could be seeded with deception that cost pennies and upended a system costing millions. The rule that radar would always see clearly had been broken in 15 minutes, and its fragments became the starting point for the electronic battlefields of the future.